if he gets an opportunity like that, he can't afford to do that. And that's why we don't see a 1e4. So no Berlin draws, no martial opportunities for Magnus. And Hikaru here starts, well, with a close strategic opening, which just means we're going to get a game, no big theoretical battles.
Yep. I love it. And the chess gods, we know they hate players who take quick draws with white, especially. So I'm really glad to see Hikaru go for it in this game, playing the Reti, one of my favorite openings. So flexible, all the pieces on the board for a long time, quite likely. And Magnus now looking off to the side, snacking up. The other day he said he loves to snack during the games, between the games. And now just choosing
What do you think
variation.
he's eating right now?
Maybe some nuts. I'm not sure. Something... Yeah,
good for the brain, yeah.
Something nutritious.
Last season on the tour, we saw him eat noodles all the time.
I remember that.
Noodle chess.
Yes.
This opening, the funny thing about it, Kaya, though, is that, you know, we're happy that we have a Reti, but it's also one of Magnus's preferred choices with the white pieces. We very often see Magnus go for this. Robert, what do you think about that? Hikaru choosing a line that Magnus himself plays so many times.
I think you have no choice because these top players play everything under the sun. And Magnus does love this as an opening weapon from the white side, but it's a good choice because you don't bring the battle immediately, and that could leave some long-term winning chances. I do think that Hikaru needs to press in this game. He can't just rely on a draw here and hope that he'll survive because he still will need a victory over Magnus Carlsen. So what are the ideas in this position? You've had no pawn tension, no trades just yet. At some point, you are going to strike in the center and create some opportunities to trade off pieces, whether it's the C pawn or the E pawn. So Hikaru has a wealth of experience himself. He's just trying to figure out what direction he wants his game to go. And I think he can push his C pawn and make it an English type of position. I think that means it's a less balance. It's not going to be symmetrical. And I think that's exactly what Hikaru has to aim for.
Yeah, the only possible problem that I foresee with this one, Robert, is that the queens might come off. Okay, he has gone for this, and I'm expecting Magnus to take this pawn. And now, if Magnus is happy with the draw, then he would be quite likely to head into the endgame. Magnus is very principled. He won't necessarily go for the most solid approach. He'll go for an approach that he enjoys playing. This is not necessarily a draw, of course. Once the queens disappear, still plenty of pieces left on the board, plenty of life left. But as far as I know, this one has a decent reputation for Black. Black is very solid. You can bring the knight out, bring the bishop out. Sometimes you can push forward this pawn. I'm not sure whether this is exactly that type of position to gain a bit more space. But either way, Magnus will be looking for a safe approach. Another one would simply be to develop the knight, defend this pawn, and play almost a Sicilian, but just with reverse colours. Magnus looking away now, deciding what move he prefers in this position.
Well, according to the math situation, it would make so much sense to trade it off and pick up the queens, and he goes for an endgame. Perhaps if it was slightly different on the scoreboard, we would have seen that knight developing move that you were talking about. And after deciding to trade, we see a few moves being blitzed off, with Magnus now making an aggressive pawn push in the center, asking white the question, where is your knight headed? Because, David, watch out. If you take it to the absolute rim of the board, if you take it to h4, there's always a chance of it getting trapped. h6 first, defend that square, and then g5 ideas, and then suddenly you don't have a good square for the knight. Of course, you have to watch out because the e4 pawn's hanging, but you don't want to put your knight on h4. So perhaps Hikaru has to retreat the knight all the way back.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be something he enjoys doing either, retreating the knight. It does take a while for this knight to get back on a better circuit. And Hikaru, I'm surprised he played this variation without having an answer prepared right now. I've got to say, it feels like he's freestyling, and freestyling against Magnus can backfire. So, yeah, either this move or maybe bringing it forward. I'm expecting one of those two. And the game will go on. Magnus, most likely, after one of these moves, is going to back up his pawn center, connect 4 right now with this nice pawn chain. And, yeah, still some chances. Magnus looks like he's loving life, though, smiling to himself.
Yeah, that's he's looking quite amused and happy with what's happening. I wonder what's going on there.
Yeah, just...
happy with life?
Yeah, happy, yeah, with something, clearly.
What's happening?
Just loving the air out there in Canada.
I have no idea, but of course he's happy about the match result thus far. He's up a full point, and with Black, he seems to have no problems out of the opening. There's Hikaru Nakamura on the clock. David was just mentioning we could see a connect 4 of those pawns, and Hikaru actually brings his knight all the way back. So Magnus has had no struggles against Hikaru over the board. He's maybe had a worse position for 2 moves total in all the games they've played here in the Airthings Masters. So why not smile? He should be happy.
You know what I think he's laughing at?
Why?
I bet it is because we know Magnus has a strange sense of music style. He loves those 90s classics. I bet the chess brass has put something on the stereo in that house, maybe a song or something like that from the 90s.
We need our viewers to send in what they think has happened.
Yeah.
What song is Magnus listening to? What's made him laugh? What's made him chuckle? A bit of a mystery. But yeah, he's got a interesting sense of humor as well. So it could be anything, knowing Magnus.
He's laughing. He's in a good mood. No doubt, Magnus Carlsen, he's in the lead in the grand final here against Hikaru Nakamura. And Hikaru is fighting to make a comeback, winning this game.
To me, it just feels like the kind of opposite of a position you want in a almost must-win situation. Now, suddenly, if you look at the white knights, one of them is stuck on the bottom of the board, one of them is stuck on the side of the board. Magnus has this perfect pawn structure. He can't control himself right now.
I'm so distracted. He's finding something so amusing right now. And I have no idea what's so funny. I mean, I get it. He's really happy with the position he's got, but he can't stop laughing.
Do you think Hikaru has Magnus's camera up on the screen?
I hope not. That is the last thing you want to see after losing a game and almost having to win on demand this one.
Yeah, and Magnus, after, I think, a battle with himself there, finally fighting off the smile. And, yeah, wow. I don't know what's happened. It's a big mystery.
And David, he needed to do that. He needed to get a grip because Hikaru did have a huge threat in that position when he developed that knight. He wanted to actually step even further on the board with that knight on the queen side. And we see Magnus's last move stops any further knight jumps. So just making sure that knight stays there. While Hikaru doing exactly what he did in game one with the white pieces, playing on the queen side here. He moves away from the long diagonal, notice that bishop on g7, targeting that pawn on b2, which really stopped white's development and flow in the way pieces would have come out. And now I'm expecting him to go one step ahead with that pawn in front of the rook to defend the c4 pawn. Robert?
I know that Hikaru Nakamura is the Fischer Random champion, but it feels like he's playing Fischer Random while Magnus is just playing regular chess. I mean, all of White's pieces are scrambled across the board here. Black's pieces on very good squares, harmonious. We have the pawn change from h7 all the way down to e4 in the center, which blunts that fianchetto bishop in front of the white king. And look at Black's fianchetto bishop on g7. It stares across the entire diagonal. Everything going right for Magnus Carlsen in this game. I don't know what he was laughing about, but he does have good reason to be happy. He has nothing wrong in his position. Everything, every piece on a good square.
Yeah, I agree. It looks like Fischer Random gone wrong for Hikaru, but he is at least trying to break that chain, break down that black pawn chain in the center, and start with the head and that e4 pawn. If he can get rid of that, suddenly the white pieces have much more freedom, much more life. And I think Magnus here would be very reluctant to trade off the pawn that has just moved on f3. He'll be looking for cleverer ways to do that. Is that a word? Cleverer? More clever ways? Wiser ways? More practical ways? And he brings his knight out. Again, look at Black's pieces. Perfect centralization. The two black knights on the square that we tell all beginners to develop them to. Just controlling everything. The two black bishops very well poised for the position to become open, and White's stragglers there. Especially those two knights. I don't like the look of them at all. Hikaru is so good at rotating his knights, but he'll find it very difficult to get them to more active posts, at least in the next few turns, while Magnus finally deals with his king, brings the black rooks to the center. No problems at all for Black. It's definitely White who's trying to equalize in this game, but that shouldn't be enough for Hikaru. Not a good start to this one.
Not a good start at all. You've got the white pieces. You want those queens on the board. You want to have a dynamic position, but instead here you are on the back foot in an endgame. And you can just aesthetically see and tell that White's position lacks so much space. Black has advanced those pawns. The pieces are out. Now looking at connecting the rooks. For Magnus, the play just seems very easy. I'm trying to figure out what it is that Hikaru can play for in this position, and the one thing that comes to mind is this connect four that you're talking about, David, with the pawns in the center. They have created some dark squared weaknesses, so perhaps Hikaru can look at developing his own bishop to a good active square, because with this pawn advance, the f4 square has been weakened. The bishop can land there, eyeing another weakness in Black's camp. Well, I wouldn't call it a weakness, but at least a pawn that is under attack. Hikaru is dreaming right now and hoping that Magnus trades those central pawns, because if he does that, then the knight can jump back into the game. The knight hops from e1 to f3, comes to the center of the board, and you're suddenly the bishop on g2 becomes active, and this is the dream position. But Magnus is never going to trade these pawns.
Yeah, he'll force Hikaru to contort himself and waste several tempi before ever allowing a trade. And remember, we've talked about this in the first game. It's about allowing a trade on your own terms. Magnus, with his last move, said, yes, you can take this pawn yourself, but I will simply recapture. I'm not even sure which way Magnus takes back. You could take with a pawn, still blunting this bishop, still caging, controlling this knight. Or you could take back with your own knight, opening up this beautiful bishop on the long diagonal and saying to black, OK, this is a nice outpost. Saying to white, this is a nice outpost, and you can only eliminate this knight at the cost of your fianchettoed bishop. And, OK, Hikaru pushes this pawn forward 1 square to b3. I don't like it. Yes, it's connect 3 this time, but far less effective than black's pawn chain, and still some dark square holes on this side of the board.
But he needs to do that also, David, to free up his own knight, because he had to defend that c4 pawn, the tip of that pawn chain that you were pointing at, so that the knight can reroute itself from c2 to hopefully the center of the board and also control that central d4 square. So it's not a happy move, but a move that had to be made at some point to free up the pieces.
And I think the reason that Magnus Carlsen is sitting and thinking right now is his king. He can castle kingside. You can't go queenside. You're not allowed to castle through check. And he does not castle. He brings his king up to f7. So he says this is a position. There are a lot of pieces, a queenless middle game, let's call it that. But my king can be safe and sound on f7 and it's closer to the center in the event I trade off the rooks.
Yeah, really nice safe square for the king, and there's no chance it's going to come under fire anytime in the next few moves. Simply, as Robert says, shifting the rook to the center. Once you contest for the d-file, the open file on the board, then all of your pieces are at play and no danger at all. I'm still expecting one of Tanya's ideas there, either first attacking this loose pawn, the only weak spot in the black camp, the Achilles heel there, or to relocate the white knight. White is solid, we should mention, so although we're kind of waxing lyrical about black's chances, Hikaru still isn't out of it yet in this game, at least not in terms of losing, but he brings his bishop to the side and Magnus finally does try to fight for this file. I'm going to stick my neck out here and predict a draw, just because it feels like Magnus doesn't need to go all out in this game, but also it feels like black is never really in trouble.
But didn't Magnus also not castle in the last game? So 2 games in a row?
True. Yeah.
How rare is that?
Well, when you get to 2,800 plus, you can break all the rules. If you're watching this at home, please cast your king, listen to your coaches, get that king safe. But Magnus's king has never been in any danger. It wasn't about his king just darting to the side of the board and just being secured by the other pieces. He's using his other pieces with great effect. And in this position without queens, his king is safe and sound.
And in both these games, we did have a queen trade out of the opening. So very often we are told that in endgames, the king has to be used as a piece. And that's what Magnus has done in this one as well, keeping it centralized, keeping it close to all his forces. It is the best square for the king. You have to connect the rooks. And the idea we were discussing, David, is on the board. Hikaru tries to reroute the knight to a better square. In the process, also controls, takes hold of those very important dark squares in the center of the board. But it still feels as if white is so passive right now.
Yeah, white's extremely passive. Even if you get kind of give Hikaru 2 moves here, I don't think he can really make headway into the black position. I simply don't know what he's trying to do next, other than exchange pieces. Yes, you can maybe lessen the pressure because you are so cramped by trading off a set of rooks, maybe even trading off a set of knights if you're given the time, but is that fighting for an advantage with white? It doesn't feel that way.
There might be one idea here, is that tension from the f3 pawn to the e4 pawn. Right now, black has 2 defenders, the pawn on f5 and the knight behind it on f6. They're both protecting that pawn. But if white says, you can have the bishop pair, I will take the material and use that bishop on b2 and takes that knight on f6, then all of a sudden, white may go up a pawn and say, where is your compensation? Maybe you objectively are better, but you're going to have to prove it. Not so easy in a position with limited material.
Yeah, so maybe a threat on the board there, Robert, after bishop takes bishop and capturing a pawn. I must admit, I wasn't even thinking of being greedy here. I'm so attached to my bishops. I have these blind spots that I forget sometimes. But you're right, that was a threat. And therefore, Magnus, not wanting to allow that to happen, he finally did trade. But now, at least after the white knight gets free, again, a possible threat for Hikaru. Suddenly his position looks far more harmonious, far better. And maybe Magnus will have to take a timeout just to block this check, just to cover this square. And, OK, finally, it does feel like Hikaru has got over his opening problems here and should be able to equalize. I don't think more than that, but at least he'll be happier than he was. And he's thinking in this position, is he really contemplating taking in any other way? I guess you could take with the pawn just to keep the pawn structure kind of almost symmetrical to try and push this pawn forward next, but it does feel very slow. I guess the idea here would be to bring the knight this direction. So possible plus sides for that move too, but Hikaru needs to play a bit quicker. He needs to at least have a time advantage if he wants to win this game.
It is a big question here for White, what you recapture with, and I think Hikaru has made, well, the more human approach here, and what seems to me the right choice to bring your pieces out, to try to play for piece activity here, and he has a huge threat on the board. We were talking about how Black needs to stop this, but this is the best position that Hikaru has had all game today, maybe all day today, actually. And we can expect some more trades of the pieces. Again, trying to open up that bishop on g2. That is the key piece in White's position, the king side bishop, the light squared bishop. Right now, stopped. Right now, there's a block on the road on that diagonal with Black's knight on c6. I'm also expecting a trade of these two knights, the white knight on the queen side and the black knight on the queen side, to open up the chances for this Fan Chateau bishop. So there are some technicalities still to be solved for Black here.
What do you think? We've talked about what Hikaru needs. Is Magnus going to be happy to just shut this one down, move on to the next game?
Yeah,
try and get a draw?
100%.
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that if he can just swap all the pieces and make a draw, he'll do that. Because with the white pieces, in game one in the winner's final, in game one here in the grand final, Magnus has had an advantage with white. He could not convert in the winner's final. Hikaru played great defense and used Magnus's clock against him. But today, that was a really good display of just complete control over the board. So we see, speaking of control of the board, Magnus pushing his rook pawn up, taking away White's lone threat in the position. And if the status quo remains, White's pawn structure is worse than Black's. You have an isolated pawn on e2. Black has 2 pawn islands. White has 3. So we have connected pawns for Black, and that one pawn on e2, that's not a happy piece. And if Black can attack it, it's going to be difficult to defend.
Yeah, and Magnus, okay, now not smiling, now frowning slightly for the first time in the game, not looking too happy. Momentum-wise, it is slightly in White's favour. I feel this position is utterly balanced. It's very equal chances for both sides. But, yeah, he definitely will feel like he had control, and he's lost a bit of control. Now it's Hikaru with a free move to try and create some threats. Maybe Tanya will be right, and we'll see one of the knights jump forward just to trade off, open up the 2 white bishops, which are very well placed on those 2 longest diagonals. Meanwhile, the air quality is much better in Magnus's room than it was at the beginning of the day. Interesting. I wonder if in the break time, maybe he went to open a window. But it served him well in game 1. He played very, very convincingly there. And, OK, Hikaru, again, needs to speed up. He needs to make a decision.
Well, if White doesn't trade off one of the knights, what Magnus wants to do in this position is actually jump with his own knight forward at the center of the board and try and trade off these dark squared bishops. And there we have it. Do we have a move? Yep. Hikaru has decided to jump in with the knight. It's so important for him to get the activity of the light squared bishop because the only target in the position for White here are Black's queenside pawns. That pawn on b7, notice that if Black does trade on d4, pick up that knight, White can jump in, pick it up with his own knight, hit that bishop on e6, also target that pawn on b7. So we see Hikaru here trying to create some chances in a position that currently looks like it doesn't have that much poison, that much venom in it. But one gets the feeling that Magnus still needs to be a little careful here.
Yeah, he definitely needs to be a little careful here. There are dual threats, as you mentioned, Tanya, this one and this one. You can solve them both with one move, just retreating the bishop. But again, it feels like a step in the wrong direction. The bishop is very, very passive here. You do hold everything together. I do wonder if Hikaru's plot, his plan here, is after knight takes knight to actually capture another way or potentially even flick in a check. I haven't worked out the consequences here, but you could at least think of flicking in a check. The king moves. Again, where does it go? This is a check hitting this pawn. And, for example, if we drop back to its start square, now Hikaru could capture this knight with his rook or with his bishop and still something to worry about, at least for Magnus Carlsen. This pawn is loose and this pawn is loose. So both flanks, both sides of the board, you have issues. And if this is a potential hazard for Magnus, then he has to go into the tank now, as he's doing, because White is adding up the threats, stepping up the pressure.
I think he's wisely spending time, as you're saying, because it could be dangerous territory for him. Every pawn push creates a weakness in your position, and here's the g6 pawn lost its friend defending it. So knight e5 check will be a big threat in a variety of positions. I do think that White's position is a little bit too loose. If we just kind of even look at this line, just two steps further, once the king slid back to the square you put it on, and we see a swap of rooks on the d4 square, that bishop on d4 is loose, and there's a bishop on g7, so the knight on f6 moves out the way either to g4 or back to d7, and we see that this bishop on d4 is hanging, the knight on e5 under attack twice. Magnus can work his way out of this, so he has everything under control for now.
Well, he does. He does pick up the knight, so this gives White the opportunity to go for this line, the intermezzo that we're talking about. And I often feel that intermezzos are the easiest moves to miss. Of course, Hikaru hasn't missed the check here, but in general, in chess, we're so tempted towards recapturing immediately. But Hikaru, of course, has found it. He knows that he needs to go in for this attack. And I really like this line, David, that you were pointing out, hitting that pawn on g6, hitting that pawn on b7, and simply recapturing the central knight with the bishop. Nice play here by Hikaru out of an opening that I don't think he was super happy about. I don't think he was ecstatic about the position that he got, but he's managed to create some chances.
An intermezzo, what does that mean?
We need to translate. There's various different words, different terms. I guess in English we would say like an intermediate move. So before playing an automatic recapture, we flick in another move first. Normally it's a check to gain some time, and only then do we capture. So, for example, in that last position, White gave up a knight temporarily and flicked in a check first. Black reacts, and now he'll regain the material balance. And that black knight in the center of the board will be taken, will be captured. There's various terms. Intermezzo, I guess, is Italian?
And it's related to music.
Okay, related to music. But there's also the German word Zwischenzug, like literally between move. And
it's basically a shocker.
Yeah.
You're expecting one thing, but you get something else.
It's normally something you don't want to see if you're on the wrong end of an intermezzo, but here Magnus reacted very quickly, did bring his king back to a central square, and Robert predicted this whole line, predicted the future. Thanks to the looseness of White's pieces, Black can solve his problems tactically. That's often what you need to do, and I think Magnus is okay.
And because, oops, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, because there was just such a good pass saying, Robert predicted the future. And the question is, has Robert predicted the future? If we have Armageddon, we have asked the expert to place their bid in this envelope for what they think the winning bid for time will be if we do see Armageddon today. I have all their predictions in this envelope, and we're also asking you at home the same question. What do you think the winning bid for time will be in Armageddon? You can tweet your answer using #ChessChamps, and one lucky winner will get an Airthings device signed by Magnus Carlsen himself.
I think right now Hikaru is dreaming and hoping to get that Armageddon in. After that first game loss, he needs to win one game in this match to just equalize, to just level the score and get into that Armageddon. But of course, that will be a whole different mind games. Different strategies. The two have already played one Armageddon, so they kind of know how they think. Magnus called it a soul read, that 1 second win that he had.
I know.
Tanya, I thought you were going to say he's dreaming of winning this Airthings device. What happens, actually, if Hikaru writes in himself, tweets in the exact time he's going to bid? Who'll be the closest?
Oh, that's a loophole.
It's a clear loophole.
I bet Airthings will be very happy to send an Airthings device to Hikaru. The question is, do you think he would want it signed by Magnus? Oh, what's happening?
Okay. Actually, nothing that dramatic, but he found a really clever way to trade bishops. I was expecting the white knight to retreat, but he found a much more active square. Sorry there, Kaya. It's just chess players kind of
reaction to a shocker.
Exactly.
Well, show us why this is so beautiful.
Now it's died down into a very normal position, but he just found an artistic way to do it. That one was for the memes, for the fans from Hikaru. So we were looking at this position. Robert predicted it pretty much. Pressure on this knight and along this diagonal. The white bishop behind it is loose, so this white knight has to defend its bishop. I was expecting just a simple drop back, and after a bishop trade, we reached this position, which actually occurred in the game. But instead, Hikaru played a move that wasn't on my radar. I've got to admit, he jumped out the other way, and it looks like the knight has just sacrificed its own life. It's committed suicide here, but luckily you're attacking this bishop, so there's no time to take this knight. Instead, we saw a trade and back to the same position, but Hikaru did it in a more forceful, more artistic way.
That was quite a stunner for a moment. And of course, it was White's dream as well to trade off this fan-shattered bishop. He's done it. What Black also wants to do is try and pick up that G2 bishop, the White's light square bishop. And the knight, I can imagine it jumping onto E3, hitting that rook on d1, hitting that bishop on g2. Let's say white does come up with the rook to d3, attacking the knight. Black can swap off this monstrous bishop that white has. And I think that's a trade that Magnus is happy about. The more pieces that get traded, black's king moves forward. We know Magnus loves his king in the center. Connect those rooks. Looks like a happy endgame for black.
Well, whether he's happy or not, he did, in fact, do this. And this is the variation we have on the board. And, well, for Magnus, there's no holes in his position, no weaknesses. That said, a knight can actually outclass a bishop in the ending because the knight can jump from color complex to color complex. It can go from light square to dark, and that bishop has to stay on the light square. So for now, everything under control for Magnus Carlsen, but there could be a future where the knight causes some problems on the dark squares that black bishop cannot handle.
Yeah, maybe at some point trying to jump into this central post, but that's why Magnus, as Tanya predicted, advancing the black king. The black king is going to be the guardian of the dark squares, while the bishop tries to get active on those light squares. So he's controlling all those color complexes for now, but Hikaru will be trying to make some headway with his knight, maybe with his rook on the open file. Still some chances. It's still imbalanced enough to win this one for both sides, but objectively, it's very, very level right now.
Both ticking down to 3 minutes on the clock. What do you think, Robert? What will be the result in this game?
It's looking to be a likely draw just because of the limited material, but it depends on Hikaru's mindset. If he really feels like he must push, and I think we've seen that throughout the game. He's kept more pieces on the board, taking some risk in the process that if he feels this is now or never, he could in fact lose this game. But I said, and we were talking about it earlier, it feels like Hikaru has to win. Now that we're here, you can't just sacrifice the match. That if he draws this game and is able to hold with the black pieces in game 3, he still will get that rebuttal game 4 with the white pieces. He doesn't want to sacrifice the entire match right now in what looks like an even endgame.
Yeah. David, when you're playing a game like this, how much of the match situation is sneaking into your head?
More than it should.
Yeah.
It's so hard to block out what's going on around you. These guys, they're very aware that there's thousands of fans watching out there cheering for them. But of course, they're able to perform under those incredible amount of pressure. For myself, I struggle, especially when I know there's so much on the line. There's a huge title, there's money, there's everything at stake. Yeah, I really have in my past, throughout my career, kind of struggled to put that to one side. But these guys are good at that. And they will find a way to focus, especially for Hikaru, I feel. For Magnus, it's maybe easier to drift because he's a point up. He knows he's done half of the hard work. For Hikaru, he is so focused on the fact he needs to win, so everything else will be blocked out just for this game or two. Meanwhile, Magnus throwing a pawn forward. He's opened up his bishop. That black bishop is now like an arrow darting down towards that white h3 pawn on the light square. Actually, there's multiple tactics in the position. Just to show one idea off here, if Hikaru is careless, I'm not sure whether it works, to be honest, but if pawn takes pawn right now and captures this pawn, black does have the option of taking this guy with his rook, luring the white king out onto a light square, a rook sacrifice, but you win back the piece immediately with a nice skewer. The king moves out the way and we capture this rook. And this is not necessarily winning for black. It's not a winning tactic, but it's just a nice way to keep things simple. And actually, a bishop often outclasses a knight with pawns on both sides of the board. Actually, this morning, I was annotating a game by our friend Simon Williams, a Ginger GM, where in the play-ins for this tournament, he won a very nice endgame with bishop for knight because there were pawns on both sides of the board racing, and the bishop, with its long range, is the superior piece. So really clever tactic from Magnus Carlsen. Dual threats now, or triple threats, of taking this pawn with this bishop, but also capturing this pawn with this rook. How does Hikaru fight against this?
Things are getting more and more difficult for Hikaru now. This last move of Magnus, some serious questions, and Hikaru's got about 2 minutes to answer. The line that you were pointing out makes one really not want to take on f4 and create all these weaknesses, the weak pawns on the king side. But the other option is equally unpleasant. If you push that pawn, the g pawn up to g4, trying to take away that key f5 square from the bishop, black can also advance his own g pawn one step ahead. And now notice this f4 pawn. It's such a big strength in black's position. We call this a protected passed pawn. One of white's pieces is forever going to be left to stop this pawn from getting further down the board, and it's a huge strength in black's position. This is a nightmare to deal with.
Yeah, and Hikaru right now just weighing up his options. Is he going to capture this pawn? Yes, but now his winning chances will disappear.
And your move's on the board, David.
Immediate blow from Magnus Carlsen. He had the time to calculate it. He's a minute up on the clock. And here, again, Hikaru, what do? You have so many weaknesses. This pawn under threat. maybe you just take this rook and go down into the endgame where it should be a draw, but you have to be careful with white.
Yeah, and he could slide his rook over instead of taking the rook all the way to the g1 square, attacking g6. But the black rook says, well, I can do the same. Slide right back to d6. And this pawn structure is better for black. We see that Hikaru actually decides to strike with the move pawn to b4. And I get the sense that he is playing for a win now. It will likely backfire. He's going to have a worse position. Black can just take this pawn on b4, and then look at this. It's like bowling when you have a split. All of white's pawns all over the place. Black's pawns are next to each other, much easier to defend, whereas white's pawns are really an ugly sight to see.
Yeah, that's an eyesore for sure. And Magnus goes for a different option. He actually went for this a-pawn immediately, but still, the same point remains. These are ugly pawns. These are ugly pawns. Advantage black right now.
And throughout the event, we've spoken about just how helpless the knights feel against a rook-passed pawn. And take a look at that a-pawn that Magnus has currently. Once it starts racing down the board, white's knight is going to find it so difficult to defend it. Robert, you were talking about a bad... Oh, my God, we have a repetition.
Are we going to get a draw? It's up to Magnus now. Hikaru leans back. He was shaking his head there. It's at Magnus's disposal. If he keeps checking and keeps pinning with the black rook, the white king has to keep running out of that rook's eye line. Do you think he's going to go for it?
But he knows he's better here. And that is so tempting to play on because Magnus, with his Magnus touch about endgames, but also the mat situation, David, is playing in his mind. He knows if he draws, he gets a white in the next game. He gets closer to that championship. But he can play on here. Magnus, I think he's going to play on.
Did you see Hikaru as well? Looked so unhappy, super unhappy for a few moments there, just bobbing his head. He was like, come on, give me the draw, give me the draw. Let's move on to the next one. But Magnus is teasing him now, not making a decision yet, not making a move.
Hikaru's really hoping for it. And Magnus goes for it. We've got a game on our hands. Wow.
Going for the win, Magnus Carlsen, and activating the black king. Oof, this one looks so good visually for black, so I don't blame him at all, Magnus, for going for this. But Hikaru needs to recompose himself now to defend.
And Magnus probably estimates his losing chances nearing 0. So even if he won't win this game, he should not lose. But look at Hikaru go. He brings his knight forward. Next will be his rook up in the king's line. Rook b6 check across the 6th rank. That b7 pawn is a bit tender. And watch out if Hikaru can push his c5 pawn. Those are double and isolated. We're talking about them being eyesores. He can eliminate his own pawns off for a trade and then maybe go after this black bishop. So a good chance for Hikaru Nakamura just to create some chaos. But ultimately, Magnus Carlsen has everything under control like he usually does.
Yeah, and I love this attitude. Just always activity over anything. That's the motto of the top chess players in the world. Now he's trading off those pawns. Again, Robert predicting the future. And look at this black bishop. Doesn't have too many safe squares. He finds one, Magnus, and Hikaru shaking his head yet again. Surely that rook is going to go and grab that black a-pawn before it starts running, before it starts making a dart towards promotion and level material. 2 pawns against 2 pawns. Still no losing chances, sorry, for Magnus Carlsen. But can he press it for the win? Hikaru, he's just furious at himself, but he needs to knuckle down and at least make a draw in this one, at least make it close in this match.
And we're going to see him give checks and Magnus falls back. Does he have to go for a repetition now? Because I don't see where you're hiding with your king unless you march all the way to the queen side.
I think Hikaru should be really grateful that he has a draw here. He looks really devastated, but just give the draw, move on to the next one. Still 2 games to catch up to get that win. This one hasn't been his best effort, but he's done enough to secure a draw, a fair result in the end. And I think we're going to see it, Robert.
Yeah, there's no choice. I mean, what can white do besides give the checks? Your pawn on c4 is loose. If you try to play for win, that outside pawn, the black rook pawn, will go up the board. So we see the check back and forth. The game is a draw. And that's a fair result, I think. Hikaru